Good to be with you again as we really end ordinary time, and we'll begin Lent next week. It's unbelievable. We have one more Sunday in ordinary time, and we sort of take a break for the holy season of Lent and Easter before we return to the ordinary time cycle. But this ordinary time Sunday is a strong Sunday, with a strong message, a very difficult message, and we have to be honest about that. It's a very honest evaluation, I think, for every Christian when we come to these passages of Jesus about love of your enemy. There's no doubt these words of Jesus are very difficult for many people. I mean, I remember I was talking with a group of, I was invited to a mosque, and it was a black mosque, African Americans mostly, and I knew the imam pretty well, and he invited me to come and give a talk about Christianity. And one of the points I covered is that Jesus offers a real challenge to us Christians in some of the things he said, and I pointed out to him, he said, one of them, to love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your heavenly Father. And in preaching and mentioning this to this group, it was a dialogue. So there were lots of questions immediately. And actually, interestingly, many of the questions were the same questions a group of Christians would have asked me. What about this, Father? What about that? How can Jesus say, love your enemies? If they do this to you, if they do that? How do we react to that? So it's a very similar kind of reaction. But let's start with that opening line from the book of Leviticus. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Wow, that sounds pretty strong. And I remember years ago I was driving through a neighboring city, and I looked up at a building, and I could read inscribed on the top of the building in the stonework, love your neighbor as yourself. I thought, and I'm driving by, I didn't have a chance to look at the rest of the building, and I was unfamiliar with that area. And I came back to our headquarters, diocesan headquarters, and I said to somebody, what kind of Catholic charities institution do we have? What kind of services do we provide on that street? And everybody said, well, there's no Catholic charities service at that street. There's no Catholic organization on that street from what we know. So I was really puzzled. So the next time I drove down to that town, that city, I was able to drive a little slower, and I looked more closely. It was a synagogue. And I thought, a synagogue. And then I realized, because it had in a little notation, Leviticus. I said, oh my gosh, that comes from the book of Leviticus. And we forget sometimes Jesus quoted when they asked him, what's the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your whole heart, your whole soul, your whole mind. That comes from the Old Testament. And then he said, love your neighbor as yourself. Of course, Jesus redefines neighbor. And it's not simply someone who is close to you, is part of your ethnic background, was not necessarily a Jewish person. But that is very important, because it reminds us that this challenge that Jesus puts out to us, like the other explanations of the Old Testament commandments, is an invitation to look at something more deeply. And one of those areas is simply, we're always dealing with strained relationships. I mean, who's an enemy? Who's an enemy? It's an interesting question. I mean, a lot of people walk around with a lot of enemies. I mean, it's not necessarily the Chinese or the Russians or some other foreign workers, some foreign elements in society, but it's somebody that looks just like them, but they're the enemy. Why? Because there's a strained relationship. Jesus says, very interestingly, for if you love those who love you, what recompense will you have? Do not the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brothers only, what is unusual about that? Do not the pagans do the same? So be perfect, just as your heavenly Father is perfect. So there's an invitation to look at the heavenly Father's love for all of his creatures. Remember, it says here, he makes his sun rise on the bad and the good, and causes rain to fall on the just and the unjust. We're trying to reach the perfection of the Heavenly Father. And so Jesus' words to us are both a challenge, a command, a striving, an attempt to live the gospel message. And it's hard sometimes because it does present some real challenges to us in our lives. But it is a challenge about strained relationships in a very general way. And we all have all kinds of strained relationships that we need, don't we, to sort of mend, to make an effort to change, to at least greet maybe some of those enemies that we have in life. God bless you now.